So what I'll be covering today is, really the process of finding scholarships, looking for scholarships, and we'll also chat a little bit about eligibility criteria. And before we start, I just also want to say a few words about Africademics, just so that you understand a little bit my background. And we also have two of our other team members here today, two of our scholarship ambassadors, who have been with us since last year. They've gone through our ambassador training, so they have become scholarship mentors with Africademics, and they will introduce themselves, I think, after my presentation, and also share a little bit about their personal experiences, because they were where you guys are sitting at some point, looking for scholarships, and they successfully managed to get scholarships. So I think there's also quite a lot that we can learn from them. So I'll start with the theory and just a little bit about Africademics. So like I said, we are a scholarship platform and community for students, for graduates, for researchers, pretty much for anything with an interest in higher education in and from Africa. I founded Africademics in 2019, which is when I was looking for a PhD scholarship in South Africa. I'm from Germany originally, but I've been living in South Africa for, I think it's 12 years now. And during my own scholarship search, I just realized that there's often this impression that there isn't really a lot of funding available on the continent or for people from the African continent. And at the same time, when I started researching scholarships, I did realize that there are a lot of opportunities out there. It's just a matter of them not being shared, them not being communicated properly. And at the same time, nobody teaches you how to apply for those scholarships. So I wanted to try and bridge that gap through Africademics. So I founded it in 2019. We are a registered nonprofit, registered in Germany, and we also rely on a volunteer-driven global network of people like our scholarship ambassadors, whom you will meet later. And we mostly work in the digital space. We were founded just before COVID. So we do most of our work online. We share scholarships, but we also offer hands-on personal support for people looking for scholarships and trying to apply for them. And we really want to make it easier to access the opportunities that are out there. So unfortunately, because we don't have lots of money, we don't offer scholarships ourselves, but we try and bridge the gap between people like you and the opportunities that are already out there offered by other organizations. And we do that by sharing information and by offering support. And we've already shared over 2,500 scholarships. So I think that's quite a landmark. And we share them online. We have a growing community. So if you're not following us for daily scholarship updates, then you can do that. And we've partnered with organizations like GAIN, which has been really amazing. And this might also be of interest for all of you. We recently launched a scholarship podcast and also a massive open online course for anyone with an interest in scholarships. I'll share the details with you later, but I think that's a good resource for you to also check out after the webinar. And we'll be adding more content on both the podcast and the course over the next few months. And then this is the other part of what we do that might be of interest. So we've trained scholarship ambassadors that are basically mentors from different African countries at different levels of study. And they are also there to offer hands-on support. And we're currently training a new group of ambassadors that will be finishing their training around July, August. So we'll have a chat maybe with the organizers as well and see if we can offer some mentorship for some of you there. And we have won prizes, so our work is being recognized, and I hope that it also inspires lots of other organizations to do similar things. Okay, so let's get started with the actual content, and I'll just briefly, I think I'll turn off my video if you don't mind, just to make sure that the internet stays stable. So when we speak about scholarships, I think we all have an idea of what it is, but I think sometimes it's quite important to remind ourselves that there are many different types of scholarships. So when I do this course for our ambassadors, I always go through quite a range of different funding types. One of those being the full degree scholarships. Now, those are obviously the main ones. Those are the ones that everybody wants. And I think those are the ones that most of you will be looking for. So that's funding to complete an entire degree at undergrad, at master's, or at PhD level. I know most of you are looking at master's and PhD. And then other types are postdoc fellowships, research fellowships. There's also non-degree scholarships, which are other types of opportunities. There's conference grants, travel grants, and there's competitions and awards. So there's quite a big scholarship landscape out there. And outside of this webinar and outside of what we're doing today, I also encourage you to look into those opportunities, especially if you're looking at building a career in academia, or if you're maybe currently doing your master's, you want to move on into a PhD, then those other opportunities are also nice stepping stones or building blocks of your academic career. But for the purpose of today, we'll just look at master's and PhD. And just to start with, it's quite important to distinguish between the different levels of funding that are out there, because sometimes we have this idea that if I get a scholarship, then all my expenses will be covered. That is the ideal case scenario, and there are fully funded scholarships out there. But at the same time, realistically speaking, not everybody will be able to get a full scholarship, right? Simply because there aren't enough of those to go around. And so it's quite important to realize that there are different types. Fully funded ones, they do cover pretty much everything from tuition fees to your living expenses, your travel costs if you're studying abroad, your medical insurance, which can also be quite a big expense. And some of those scholarships also cover additional expenses, like maybe your books, a laptop, a research stipend, and so on. So those are the best ones, the nice ones. But in addition to those, a lot of the scholarships that you guys will probably come across are actually partial scholarships. And quite often, those are awarded in the form of a tuition waiver. So a lot of universities, when you apply, there is the possibility of getting a scholarship through the university, but quite often that only covers your tuition fees, right? Sometimes there's a little bit of an extra allowance, maybe for travel, maybe for accommodation, but it's quite often that we hear from students that they got into a university and they got a tuition fee scholarship, can cover the whole fees or just a part of it. But then there is still that additional question of, okay, I also have to live and I have to pay rent, and there's all sorts of other expenses, right? So for you as an applicant, it's obviously important to be aware of that, but also to, before you even start looking for funding, to actually sit down and make an assessment of your financial needs. And just also to be very realistic about the total cost of your studies, and not just look at your tuition fees and maybe your travel costs and your rent, but all those other little expenses that you tend to have. So in addition to your tuition fees, your travel, you also have to consider your medical insurance. Even if maybe back home you don't have medical insurance because it's not compulsory, but overseas, most universities require you to have insurance. And also for purposes of applying for a visa, you will have to have medical insurance. And depending on the country, that can be quite costly, right? Then there's obviously housing. You might be lucky and get on-campus housing, which might be subsidized, but you might also have to rent your own apartment. And then there's your living expenses, your groceries, your Wi-Fi, your electricity, study materials, your clothing. If you move to the northern hemisphere, guys, it gets cold. You will need winter clothing and lots of it. And then there's also additional activities that you may want to do. There's transport to get from point A to point B. So think this through, and also do your research about the country and the city and the university that you want to study at, simply because those costs, they differ quite a lot. Whether you're studying in, I don't know, New York or in rural Virginia, right? Or if you're studying in Paris or in some small town in Germany. So do your research on that and start with an assessment of the amount of money that you will need, and to also see whether you will actually need a full scholarship to study at a certain university, or if you would be okay with a partial scholarship. And then that should inform the types of universities that you apply for. And then another important consideration is actually also whether or not you will be allowed and able to work during your studies. So if you want to study in a certain country, does you having a study visa permit you to work part-time, for example, have a student job, or work as a waitress or a retail worker, whatever it might be? while you study there, which is also important because that might be a source of income if you can't get a full scholarship. And will you actually have the capacity to work while you study? Are you someone who can multitask and juggle many different things? Or are you going to have to focus fully on your studies, and is work actually not an option for you? So also something to consider. And obviously, as a last resort, would you or your parents be willing and able to apply for something like a student loan? Are there special student loans in your country that you can access? Are there relatives that might support? Can you fundraise? Just in case you don't manage to get a full scholarship and you have to somehow supplement your partial funding. Okay, then, as I said, there are also quite a lot of differences between master scholarships and PhD scholarships. So looking at master scholarships, obviously, what is it? It's either full funding or partial funding for a master's degree. And in terms of the duration, it's usually awarded for either 1 year or 2 years. It depends on how long the master's degree is in the country where you're planning to study. I know a lot of UK masters are just 1 year. If you're looking at a lot of continental European countries, Germany, Netherlands, I think as well, then a lot of master's degrees are 2 years in duration. And most of the scholarships in those countries are then adjusted or offered depending on how long a master's degree normally takes. In terms of who funds them, and this is important because, as we'll see later, if you know who funds these scholarships, you also know where to look for them. So a lot of master's scholarships are either funded or advertised through universities, but there are also quite a lot of foundations that offer master's funding. In some countries and in some cases, there are government schemes for scholarships. Again, Germany, Netherlands, a lot of Eastern European countries also. Some in the States, so a lot of countries do have that also for foreign students. And then not so many, but some are funded by companies or also by nonprofit organizations. So there's quite a lot of different types of funders out there at master's level. And eligibility, we'll chat about that in more detail later. But just to briefly mention this with regards to master scholarships. So the two main criteria that funders look at, especially at master's level, are your academic performance, so merit, and your financial needs. So in most cases, you will have to prove that you did especially well in your undergraduate studies. And in some cases, in many cases, you will also have to prove that either you or your parents have very limited income. In some scholarship programs, there's also restrictions that they only fund degrees in very specific subjects, or some scholarship programs also fund particular demographic groups or nationalities. So for example, there's scholarships that specifically fund women or ethnic minorities or people with disabilities. And then with a lot of scholarships, there are, restrictions with regard to your nationality. And we'll chat about that later, but it's very important for you to read through the eligibility criteria and make sure that your nationality and your country is actually covered, because quite often scholarships are very specific. Then in terms of studying abroad, because that's always a question, so are there a lot of scholarships for international students in that field or at that level? Luckily, at master's level, there are a lot more scholarships for international students than at undergraduate level. So that's good news for you, because I know lots of you want to study abroad. And what I'd like to encourage you to do is to also not just think of English-speaking countries when you look at the universities where you want to apply, but also at English-taught courses in countries where English is perhaps not the main language, simply because a lot of those countries have a lot more scholarships than in English-speaking countries. And also generally the cost of living and the tuition fees in European countries, in Asian countries, tend to be a lot lower than in your US, UK, Australia, Canada. So it is worth expanding your geographic horizon a little bit, because there are a lot of excellent universities in non-English speaking countries where you can nevertheless study in English. And yeah, in terms of the application process, that's not so relevant for you right now, but to keep in mind that some scholarships do require you to have an offer to study or an admission letter from your university, but some of them don't. So that's also just something to watch out for when you read the eligibility criteria and application process. Just check if you have to submit an admission letter with your scholarship application, or if you can apply for the scholarship and then later supply proof of admission. And in some cases, if a scholarship is offered through the university, then often there isn't even a separate application process. So then quite often when you fill in your university application, you just need to tick a box, or you need to fill in a little extra section if you want to apply for financial aid, and then you're automatically considered. That's quite nice, but also just keep in mind it's not always like that, and quite often it's a separate process. Okay, these are just a few examples of master scholarship programs that run on an annual basis. I'll share the slides with you later, so you don't have to write them down or screenshot them now. But yeah, those are all scholarship programs that typically run on an annual basis. So those are good places to start in terms of fully funded scholarships as well. And some of them cover studies in different countries. Some of them are country specific. So this is just for you to maybe take a look at later after the webinar when you start doing your own scholarship research. Okay, now let's chat a little bit about PhD scholarships. In some countries, they're also called studentships, especially in the UK. You'll often see studentships advertised for PhD students. It's essentially the same thing, different terminology. Sometimes they're also called fellowships. So what is it? Again, it's obviously either full funding or partial funding for your doctoral studies. And what's different compared to master's studies and master scholarships is that quite often PhD funding is combined with part-time work at the university or the research institution. So quite often that means that it's not so much a scholarship, it's actually more of a salary. And it does require you to work in your institute or at your university, which can be nice if you're someone who wants to also gain work experience and get more into that academic work environment. At the same time, it can also mean that unless the work you're doing is very closely aligned with your PhD research, that you might be spending less time on your research and more on things like teaching or other kinds of research. But that's how it is in many countries. And normally PhD funding is awarded for about 3 to 4 years. Again, I mean, that's kind of the average ideal case scenario, full-time PhD student duration. I mean, I'm currently doing a PhD. I'm in my 5th year, but that's also because I'm doing academics and all sorts of other things on the side, which is also why my own scholarship is now running out. So if you get a scholarship, try not to do too many things on the side, unless it's worth it, which academics is. So sometimes there's the option to extend, but generally PhD funding is for 3 to 4 years. And the nice thing is, kind of the higher up on the academic ladder you climb, the more generous the scholarships and the funding tend to get. So a lot of the PhD scholarships, studentships, whatever you want to call it, are fully funded. So they will cover your tuition fees, and there is typically a living allowance, which you can then use for accommodation or whatever it might be. And then quite often you also have access to additional funding for conferences or for field work, because obviously your PhD includes quite a bit more research work. Then who funds PhD scholarships? Quite a lot of funding at that level is channeled directly through universities, not always through the university as a big entity, but quite often there is a lot of funding in individual departments or in individual research institutions within the university, simply because quite often a department or a research group will apply for a grant They get a grant, and then that grant includes funding for 2 postdocs and 3 PhD students, and then this particular department or research group will have funding. So this is not always channeled directly through the university as such, and a lot of funding is actually quite hidden within the different structures of a university, which means that you as a PhD student also have to do a little bit of digging and asking around and reaching out to people. But there are a few programs outside of universities. So some of the foundations that I've mentioned, they do fund PhDs. Some governments also have PhD funding programs. So it's not all restricted to universities, but I would say generally for PhD, your university will be your starting point when you look for funding. Then eligibility. So with masters, as I said, quite a lot of master scholarships are restricted to applicants from certain nationalities. Now with PhD, it tends to be a bit more open. There are programs that are only available to certain nationalities or to students from sub-Saharan Africa or from low-income countries. But generally speaking, it's a lot more open. So a lot of the positions don't come with a certain nationality requirement attached. And it's a lot more up to the supervisor or the research group leader or project leader in many cases, who they want to award the funding to. So in a way, it's a bit more flexible. Generally, what they obviously look at is also your research experience, your research proposal, your research topic. Does that align with the institute or with the group? And generally, the more research experience you have, the more likely you are to get funding in that field. And yeah, study abroad. Yeah, most PhD positions are really available to people from anywhere in the world. So as I said earlier, the higher up you climb, the more funding is available and the more open the funding gets. And there is funding for different types of PhD degrees, and that's maybe also something to mention, because depending on the country and depending on the university, you might have PhD programs that are coursework based. So there's quite a strong coursework element, meaning that you'll be taking courses for a year or two, and only then do you jump into your research. If I remember correctly, a lot of US universities have that approach. Or in other countries, you will have a purely research-based PhD degree. So in South Africa, at my university, it's you and your supervisor, and you can go to seminars if you want, but there's no coursework, there's nothing compulsory. It's really close to 100% research. So when you look for PhD programs and positions, that's also just something to keep in mind in terms of the structure of the program and what it will require. And yeah, application. So this is also a little bit different from most master scholarships, is that, yeah, as I said earlier, so a lot of funding is available within a department or a project or a research group. So the application process is often not channeled so much through the university itself or through a central institution. But quite often, once you've been accepted as a PhD student or into a program, you can then start asking around, approach your supervisor. And if they're a nice supervisor, then they will try their best to help you out in terms of funding. Quite often, they have access to funding sources that are not advertised openly with the university. And also with PhD funding, it's a lot more flexible generally. So quite often, there isn't a fixed application deadline. Applications might be accepted on a rolling basis throughout the year, or sometimes there might just be a call for a very specific scholarship that's offered as a once-off, right? And yeah, usually the application process is a bit more extensive, and almost always will you need to have a proposal, or at least a draft proposal of your research ready. They might require a writing sample, usually a letter of motivation. So it is generally a lot more extensive than at master's level, but then again, it is also more generous at PhD level. Okay, so that's just a very high level overview. And those are a few examples of PhD scholarships that you can or may want to look at. Again, those are just a few And I've tried to pick the ones that offer programs, excuse me, on an annual basis. So those are not the once-off ones, but actually programs that offer scholarships pretty much every year. Okay, so we've covered the different types of scholarships, or at least the ones that I think will be relevant to you. Now, the big question is always, where do we find them, right? Where do I even start looking? And I know it can be very overwhelming. I mean, back then, I kind of just started Googling scholarships to do a PhD in South Africa, and lots of things came up, and a lot of them weren't very useful. So I know it can be a little bit overwhelming and a little bit discouraging at the beginning. So that's why we've put together a little guide for you, like how and where to even get started, and also to make sure that you find reliable information. And and that's why I earlier mentioned the institutions that typically fund scholarships, because that is your starting point when you look for funding, right? If you know who funds something, then you can start with those types of organizations. So firstly, and this is always your first point of call, is the university where you want to study, or even specific departments within that university, or a specific research institution at that university. So it's really worth digging through the university website, finding out the different institutes. If you're looking at UK universities, you know, they're organized by colleges. So each college might have its own funding and its own website. So it's really worth checking those out. And then, of course, there's scholarship foundations like the MasterCard Foundation, Konrad Adenauer Foundation. There's the Fulbright Scholarship. Okay, that's a government program, but there are quite a few foundations, both corporate and private or non-profit. And then again, government. As I said earlier, a lot of governments have programs both for their own citizens who want to study in their country, but also for international students. And I'll show you some of those governments or government agencies later. Most European countries have a government agency that's responsible for international students, and where you can find a scholarship database, and you can basically just browse there and see what you can find. And then, of course, companies, nonprofits, other organizations. And here, and this is where Africademics also comes in, scholarship platforms and newsletters. We'll talk about the pros and cons of each of these just now. And then there's also social media messenger groups. So that's a little bit more of an informal space, but also very useful if you know how to navigate it. And your personal networks, guys. And do not underestimate this. Every single person that you've met throughout your studies, be it your peers, be it tutors that you've worked with, be it professors, be it lecturers, anyone could be a potential source of scholarship information. So the more you work your existing personal networks, the higher your chances of finding something. So as much as there's a lot of information out there in the formal spaces, it's quite often those personal networks that really help you find something. So don't underestimate that. Okay, now when we look at universities and colleges as a source of scholarship information, they mainly advertise all different types, right? So you will find full scholarships there. They do offer partial ones. Like I said earlier, a lot of those scholarships will be tuition fees only, simply because for a university, that's an easy thing to do, right? It doesn't require them to get extra funding. They just enroll a student without getting fees for them. So, I mean, it's a much simpler form of scholarship for a university to offer. And what a university also normally advertises are study abroad opportunities. So once you're a student at that university, if they're on the ball, if they have a good international office, they will also advertise study abroad opportunities for you. So doing a semester abroad during your studies or going to a conference. So that's also why I always say, like, your scholarship search, it doesn't stop once you've made it into the university. But while you're there, make use of the opportunities that are offered there to existing students. And so your first port of call, so to speak, would be the international office or the postgraduate funding office or the student affairs department. Yeah, I mean, they call it differently at different universities, but there is normally a central office that assists students from other countries that need funding. And then, as I said earlier, individual departments and schools. So if you don't see any information on the big university website, it's really worth reaching out to those individual departments and schools, because there might be low-level funding opportunities for you there. Okay. Yeah, and then, I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but I thought I'd put it there. So the university website is really your first place where you start. There's usually always a fees and funding section where you find the scary stuff, which is how much you have to pay. But then normally you also find the good stuff, as in what does the university know about available scholarship programs. Keep in mind, the university doesn't know everything, and the university will only list programs that they collaborate with, and there might be foundations and other institutions out there that don't work directly with the university, but that fund students regardless of where they study. So if you don't find something on the website or through the university, it's not the end of the journey. It just means that one particular source of information doesn't work for you. And yeah, as I said, guys, also check individual degree program websites, because all of those will have sub-pages. And yes, it's a bit of detective work, but in the end, that's how we find information. And yeah, try and get the contact details of individual staff members in the postgraduate funding office, or write to professors that you are likely to work with and potential supervisors, and ask them about funding opportunities. Obviously, be polite and do it in the correct way. I mean, we can't cover this here, but also, I mean, you have to be strategic and diplomatic about that, and not just send a cold email asking someone for funding, because that will probably not be successful. But yeah, individuals are a great source of information, and not just a website. I think that's the point that I'm trying to get across. And yeah, especially at PhD level, guys, those funding opportunities are often not published. Quite often a professor or a research group will sit on funding, and then when the right candidate comes along, it gets allocated. So don't be discouraged if you don't see anything advertised, but don't hesitate to ask and to make your own inquiries. And yeah, guys, like, again, it doesn't have to be a scholarship, right? If it's a research assistant position that comes with a tuition fee waiver, then that might be enough. And then you get work experience at the same time. So also be a little bit flexible and open-minded to different funding scenarios, because it doesn't have to be a scholarship. There are other options to finance your degree as well. Okay, so in addition to universities, we also have research institutions. They are a little bit different because they can be independent. They might not necessarily be a university, but even if you study at a university, you might get funding from a research institution that's affiliated with that university, or even that's independent, obviously, assuming that you conduct research in a particular field. With these institutions, because they are research institutions, they fund mostly at PhD and post-PhD level. But for those of you looking in that field, I think that might still be quite useful. And then, what do we have here? Yeah, so with those research institutions, quite often they don't have annual programs as such. So quite often they get funding for a specific project that might be once off. And then at a random time in the year, there might be a call for PhD students or for researchers. So that's why it's always important, guys, to keep your eyes open at all times, right? Don't just look for scholarships today or this week, because a lot of funding becomes available at very random times of the year or at very irregular intervals. So it does really pay off to keep your mind and your eyes open at all times. There are a few ongoing and annual programs as well. But yeah, guys, and research institutions are also quite a nice stepping stone if you are planning to pursue a career in that field and gain work experience outside of your university. Because some research institutions, they might be private, they might be linked very closely to the private sector, which can be interesting if you're planning to go into consulting, for example, or even if you're planning to go into government or into a think tank. Not everybody wants to work in academia. So depending on what your interests are, but it might also be nice to explore funding sources outside of the university if you want to diversify a little bit. Okay, then we have government as a source of funding. Now, as I mentioned earlier, governments normally distinguish between giving funding to their own citizens versus giving funding to foreigners or for international students. And at undergraduate level, most governments only fund their own citizens. And then the higher up you go, the more funding also tends to be allocated for internationals, because for a government to get qualified academics or researchers from abroad makes more sense than funding undergraduates who just come and complete their studies and then they go back home, right? Now, if we look at governments funding students locally, so if you are looking at studying in your own country, I know a lot of you are looking to study abroad, but then at the same time, it might be important to just consider that. So some governments offer funding at national level, but in some cases, there's even provincial governments or local governments, like here in South Africa. Even municipalities sometimes have scholarship schemes. And I know in South Africa, we're quite lucky because there is relatively quite an abundance of funding, not so much for international students, but for South Africans, there's quite a lot. I know it's not like that in many other countries, but if you are in South Africa, it's definitely worth checking out your provincial, your local government, your municipalities for scholarships and bursaries. Then I mentioned this earlier. So if a country decides to fund international students coming to their country, they often do that through the embassies. So if you are in Kenya, then the United States Embassy or the German Embassy or the French Embassy in your country is a good place to start inquiring about scholarships, because they normally administer them and they quite often process the applications. So I know the US embassies, they always process the Fulbright scholarship applications. And then the French embassies, they process the applications for the programs that they fund. So checking your local embassies websites, also a very good idea. Sometimes they have newsletters, quite often social media, and we'll chat about that in more detail, but social media are a great source of information, especially for those bigger institutions. And what's also nice is that on those websites, you will find a lot of extra resources. They often publish alumni testimonials and those kinds of things, especially for the long-standing programs. So you can also get application tips there. So that's quite a good place to check out. Then foundations and organizations. Yeah, they overlap a little bit with the other categories, simply because some foundations and organizations advertise their scholarships through universities. So what you will sometimes find on a university website is that university says, we offer this what foundation scholarship, and they administer the application process and everything. It's just actually funded through someone else. For you, it doesn't make a difference. But in terms of foundations and organizations, there are also those government agencies that can be linked to an embassy, but that can also be separate entities. So for Germany, it's the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD. For Netherlands, it's NAFIC. They have different agencies in different countries. For France, it's Campus France. They do have offices in a lot of different countries. And then for things like the Fulbright Scholarship, there's the Fulbright Commission. So check out the websites of those institutions. These other ones, that's not so relevant at the moment. Maybe also just to mention companies. So In some countries, again, I can mention South Africa as an example, but also a lot of Western, Northern European countries, companies do fund bursaries. It's mostly in the technical field, so I know that's not so much where you guys are based, but in some cases, humanities business is also funded. I think some consultancies fund, some think tanks have scholarships. So it is worth checking out the private sector as well for fundings, and NGOs. And generally it's quite a diverse set of funders in this category. And I just want to mention this again, a lot of funding opportunities are not necessarily annual recurring programs, but quite often there are funding opportunities that are just once off. There's one project or there's a new organization, and they're quite easy to miss if you don't constantly keep an eye on the scholarship landscape. So that's why I always encourage everyone to make the scholarship search an ongoing process. To, every week you allocate an hour or two to your scholarship search. You subscribe to the relevant newsletters. You keep an eye on what's happening, just to make sure that you don't miss those once-off funding opportunities. And then we have scholarship platforms. That is where, as I said, Africademics comes into play. And I mean, we're not the only ones doing this, right? There are lots of other organizations that do similar things, that share information, and that just try and make existing programs more available for people. So, and the nice thing is that we gather information from everywhere, from different countries, from different universities. So you have a one-stop shop for scholarship information, basically. And most of these organizations, like we do, have a website. There's a searchable database for scholarships, and we're very active on social media. We have newsletters. So it's easy for you to keep track of a lot of different opportunities through these platforms. And then like we do, some of these organizations have a lot of additional information, application advice, support materials, webinars, and so on. The pros or the plus side, as I said, of scholarship platforms is really that they have a very wide range of opportunities. So you'll find all the different fields of study. You will find all the different levels of study from different sources. They're usually updated very regularly. And in most cases, there will be a newsletter you can subscribe to, or you have a scholarship alert that alerts you when there's new opportunities. So it's very useful to work through scholarship platforms. Now, one of the cons or the negatives that I found, not with Africademics because I insist on that, but a lot of the other platforms, they fund themselves through ads. So a lot of the pages are quite filled with ads and with pop-ups, and especially if you access it on your mobile phone, sometimes you don't know if you're clicking on a scholarship or an ad. And that's something that I personally don't like, even though I understand that you need to somehow finance your page or whatever it might be. In some cases, and some organizations tend to share opportunities quite late. We always try and publish our opportunities at least a week or two before the deadline. Sometimes with some of the newsletters I get, there are opportunities in there that are already expired, which are obviously then not very useful. And you don't always know how reliable the information is, because everything that you get through one of these platforms is obviously taken from somewhere else. So you can't always be sure that you have the most up-to-date version. But these are very, very good places for you to start, just to find opportunities. So of course, there's Africademics. We share scholarships on Facebook every day. We have WhatsApp groups that you can join, and we have a weekly newsletter where we share scholarships. So that's completely free and very useful. This is another organization. They also have a lot of opportunities. They have a database, opportunities for Africans. They have a very good newsletter, not always completely up to date, but lots of good opportunities. After School Africa as well, Scholars for Dev, bursaries. Okay, this is a South African page, but very useful as well. And scholarship positions, that's more for US, UK, Australia, very Anglophone. So if that's where you're looking for funding that might be something for you. So those are some of the main platforms. So I would just suggest that you guys go and subscribe to all of those and get the updates and make sure that you know what's happening in the scholarship space. Okay, then social media and messenger groups. So that is quite a big space. We are very active there. We use social media and messenger to distribute scholarship info. And obviously, so do all the big scholarship foundations and lots of universities and institutions, but also individuals that are passionate about sharing scholarships. So you get official pages for universities, for example, but also a lot of informal groups and channels, which are run by all sorts of different organizations. Obviously, yeah, your typical social media platforms, WhatsApp, Telegram also is becoming more common. And yeah, like the nice thing about is that these are very easily accessible. You can share them easily. You can get information from your own network. So if you follow the right people and the right institutions, then they will share the updates with you. And yeah, you don't need as much data as you would if you spend hours and hours browsing websites. So there are lots of pros. On the other hand, yeah, like the social media and messenger space, it's very informal sometimes. So you can't always verify that you're really getting the complete information, and not all sources are reliable. And unfortunately, there are also a lot of scams out there in the scholarship space. And I did not know this when I started Africademics, but now the more I interact with people who are looking for scholarships, the more I realize and I hear stories about people just being scammed when looking for scholarships. So I did put together one warning slide for you guys, because unfortunately there are scholarship scams, there are scholarship scammers, and they love social media and messenger groups. We've had some people entering our groups even, and then sharing weird messages. And if you know what a scam looks like, you can spot it immediately. But if you don't, and if you're desperate for a scholarship, it's very easy to fall for them. So just in terms of how to spot a scholarship scam, one sign, this is not a dead giveaway, but if you're not getting an official link to something, like it's one of those shortened links like bit.ly or whatever. I mean, we also use that because sometimes you have a very long URL and you want to shorten it and you use one of these things. But what it does is it obscures the actual website that you are being directed to. So that can be something. And quite often these links will not lead to an actual website, but they lead to an online form where you are immediately asked to enter your details. So if that happens, then it's usually not a good sign. And guys, don't just enter your details on random forms that you are directed to unless you find that form on an official website, an official university or organization's website. And what they also do quite often is they promise you this big package of, you get a full scholarship, you get a visa, you get a work permit, you get permanent residence in that country, you get full insurance and this and that. And guys, this is not something in 99% of cases that comes with a scholarship. Like a scholarship cannot really be a way to a work permit or permanent residence. It's not how it works. Your degree can be a pathway to that, but none of the scholarships that I know come with a promise of a work permit or permanent residence or anything of that sort. So if you see all of these combined in one message, then it's probably a scam. And this is the other thing. If it sounds too good to be true, then chances are it really is. So it's really important that if you come across something on a group, or if somebody sends something to you, do your own research on Google and find out, is this scholarship really offered by a university? Who is this person that is messaging me? Has somebody come across them? And if you are unsure, then you can always contact the university or institution. So if somebody is promising you funding for a specific course for a university, find that university online and email their funding department and ask them if that is legit. And and this is the main thing. Guys, if you have to pay for it, if anybody asks you to pay a fee for a scholarship or an application, then it's definitely a scam. So no legitimate scholarship will ever ask you to pay to apply for it. So if there's any fees involved in applying for a supposed scholarship, then it is probably a scam. So very important, please keep that in mind. Okay, sorry, just had to drink a sip of my tea here. Yeah, so how to find scholarships. I won't go on for too much longer, but yeah, just a few last slides. So one a bit labor-intensive strategy is to really visit all the websites of those institutions that we've just covered and just to regularly check if there are any updates. The more convenient way is to really subscribe to all the newsletters. You can even, if you don't want your inbox spammed with all the newsletters, just create a separate email address and use that to subscribe to all the scholarship newsletters and university newsletters that you can find. And then once a week, you sit down and you check that inbox and you go through everything. So let the opportunities come to you guys. And same with the platform updates. Yeah, check relevant social media accounts as well. Like I said, I know Facebook is becoming a bit outdated, but a lot of institutions still use it a lot. So you can find quite a bit of info there. There are Facebook groups, even though, once again, some of them are dodgy. I can't really vouch for any of them. But yeah, guys, join them, check the new content regularly. And I really advise you to set aside a specific time slot every week that you dedicate to your scholarship search. And yeah, I said this earlier, activate your personal networks. Think about all those people that you've come in touch with over the years at your university, or if you've worked before. I mean, anyone in that space, anyone who has ever studied, who has done a master's or a PhD might have information for you. So literally sit down, go through your phone or through your email address book, and you will be surprised at how many people are in there that could potentially help you with your scholarship search. Okay, guys, and this, like, if you're taking away one thing from today's webinar, then I want you to take this away. Guys, the only way to really have a structured and successful approach to the scholarship search is to track and record all the information you find. It's not possible for the human brain, unless you are a genius, to keep track and remember all the details about all those different scholarships that you will come across. So set up a spreadsheet where you also maybe track the universities and the courses that you want to apply for, and then have a spreadsheet for your scholarship. And I can even send you a template, but it's really, name of scholarship, how much does it cover, what are the application criteria, what's the annual application deadline, does it cover any university or specific universities, what documents are needed to apply for it. And then you have a column where you track your own progress, where you say, okay, I have now collected all the information. Okay, I have now submitted my application, whatever it might be. And as with that dedicated time slot for your scholarship search, you also use that to just update and record and track everything in there, because otherwise you'll be confused, you'll miss deadlines, and that's not what you want. So be strategic. I know not everybody loves spreadsheets. I do love them because they're also useful if you just use them properly. So please take this as a takeaway and be methodical and strategic in your scholarship search and an application process as well. And then this is another one, guys, big takeaway. So the biggest mistake that I see people make is that they start looking for funding after they've been admitted to their university or their course. So every year when universities send out their admission letters, I get lots of emails from people that say, I've been admitted, I'm about to start my course in a month or two, but I don't have funding. And at that point, it is most likely too late to actually apply for a scholarship. So, and you guys are doing the right thing because you're here today. So you know that you have to look for a scholarship either before you apply for admission or while you're busy applying for university admission. It really goes hand in hand, because it's also important for you to know where to put your time into and your energy, right? So if you apply for a university and you already know that there is no funding whatsoever available, then perhaps you should use the time you would have used to apply to that university to find other universities that are similar and where there is funding available. So the funding and the university applications, they must go hand in hand. They must inform each other. And also, guys, once again, like be flexible regarding the country, the university, even the course that you want to apply for, obviously within reason. I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't reach for the stars and apply to study at Harvard if that's what you want. But just make sure you have backups and be flexible with those. A good degree from a university in a country that is not the US might be more useful in the end if you walk away with no student debt and a good degree in your hand, right? So be flexible. And as I said earlier, make the scholarship search an ongoing project. Don't just look now and say, oh no, but there's nothing for me. Opportunities come up all the time, and you'll see that once you start subscribing to all the newsletters. And yeah, guys, be methodical. I've said that already. So use that spreadsheet to track the application deadlines, track your progress towards them, and yeah, and don't leave the applications until the last minute. That's, I think, another important piece of advice. Okay, I just very briefly want to touch on eligibility criteria, and then I'll stop and hand over to my colleagues. But this is important because it also helps you determine whether or not you should even bother applying for a specific scholarship. So eligibility criteria, what does it mean? It's the framework that basically determines who can and should apply for a scholarship, and it is what the application selection committee considers when they go through all the application. So I've already mentioned a few criteria earlier. So a lot of scholarships are, for example, only open to people of a certain age or of a certain nationality, gender. They might tie it to academic performance, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of hard and soft skills, basically, that are looked at. And yeah, why this is important is that, I mean, applying for a scholarship, it's quite a bit of work. Preparing the documents, writing your motivation letter, and you don't want to waste that time on something that you're not actually eligible for. And that's another thing that I see very often, where people tell me, no, but I've been applying for scholarships left, right, and center. And then you ask them which scholarships they've been applying for, and then you look at the criteria and you see, okay, but you're applying for opportunities that you're too old for, or that you have the wrong nationality for. And if you do that, your application gets dismissed before anybody even looks at it, right? So if you don't meet the basic criteria, don't bother applying for it, and rather use that time to apply for something that you actually are eligible for. And so the main distinction we have when it comes to those criteria is hard and soft criteria. So it's, as I said earlier, it's good to be ambitious, but it's also important to be realistic. And this is the one that I was looking at. So some eligibility criteria are really non-negotiables. Those are your hard eligibility criteria. And those are the ones that you have to identify immediately when you read through a scholarship description. And if you don't meet them, don't bother applying for them. But there are other criteria that might be listed, but those are not knockout criteria. So even if you don't meet them or you don't fully meet them, you can still apply for that scholarship. There is still a chance that you might get it. So those are the scholarships where you know, you don't have to dismiss them. You can apply for them. And even if you don't meet certain criteria 100%. So the big question here is really how to distinguish between hard and soft eligibility criteria, right? And it's mostly in the wording already. So for hard criteria, it's usually worded in such a way that it says, okay, applicants must have, or applicants must be, or the program is only open to, or candidates without XYZ will not be considered. So if you read carefully, you can already spot those criteria. And quite often those relate to age, to nationality, to gender, or to a certain degree that you must have completed. And I'll show you some examples just now. And this is quite often just due to funding guidelines that were set by whoever funds the scholarship, and these can't just be changed. So even if the selection committee really likes your application, there's nothing that they can do. Those criteria are set. Then with the soft criteria, once again, you can mostly spot them in the wording. So it will say things like applicants should be from country XYZ, or a certain skill is desirable, or candidates with, I don't know, fluency in French will be given preference. So again, you can actually spot it if you read carefully. And typical examples of that are things like your financial situation, or how well exactly you have performed, your field of study, leadership qualities, and so on. So with those, there is flexibility. And I'll show you some examples now. So this is from the MasterCard Foundation Scholarship. And it reads that candidates must be 29 years old or under at the time they apply. That's very clear. They must be, right? Or for graduate master's degree, candidates must be 35-year-old or under at the time they apply. So if you're above 35 and you want to apply for that particular master's scholarship, don't bother. This is a hard criteria. It's not worth applying if you're over. Or then this one, this is from the Rhodes Scholarship for Kenya. You must be a citizen of Kenya. You must have also been resident in Kenya for at least 5 of the last 10 years. Very clear. There's no room for negotiation here. If you don't meet that, don't bother applying for it. Soft criteria. So this is again from the MasterCard Foundation Scholarship. So it says something like, to be considered for the program, students must be academically strong, and they must have demonstrated a commitment to making a difference in the lives of others. Now, what does that mean? There's no definition here of what academically strong means. It can mean anything from having straight A's to having a B but being the best in your class, or just to be the best out of whichever pool of applicants they get this year, right? So, and same with this other part, like demonstrate a commitment to making a difference in the lives of others. I mean, that can be anything from founding and running your own NGO to tutoring a primary school student. I mean, it's very, very broad. So there's a lot of scope for you to argue and, to meet that criteria in one or other way. Or here, academic achievements and academic potential. I mean, what does that mean? That can be anything, right? And also things like language skills will be taken into consideration, but it doesn't mean that if you don't have language skills that you're not considered, right? So those are examples of soft criteria. So once again, be aware of those and don't get discouraged if you don't meet any of these criteria. Those are not hard criteria. You can still apply. And also, remember that with those soft criteria, whether or not you're now the highest scoring person in a particular field, it always depends on who else is applying that year. And that's not something that you know. So don't decide not to apply just because you think someone else might be better. You might just be the top one in that particular category, right? And again, it's possible to also compensate or to explain why you don't meet a certain requirement. And that's what your letter of motivation is for. That's why in many cases, you can submit additional documentation to motivate why maybe you don't meet this perfectly, but it's enough, right? So it takes a bit of judgment and creativity, but it is something that can be navigated. And and just another few tips on this topic of soft eligibility criteria, guys. Remember that just because you meet a certain criteria now, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it. So if you see that a certain skill is advantageous for your scholarship application, then why don't you take a free online course and get a certificate for that and have something to show that you have taken, at least an effort in that field. Or if a scholarship is for a very specific field of study, and maybe what you are studying is not quite that, but it's very closely related to it. Then in your motivation letter, for example, you can explain that, okay, maybe my degree doesn't say graduated in this particular field of study, but I've taken lots of classes in that field. And I just have a massive interest and I did a research project on that. So you can motivate. Then sometimes there's a work experience requirement. So, okay, maybe you haven't worked, maybe you haven't had a job, but you can still do an internship, or you can at least get volunteer experience in the next few weeks and months to boost your CV and to boost your scholarship application, right? And same with leadership skills. I mean, a lot of scholarships require that, or they ask for leadership skills without necessarily defining what it means. So this is also, again, it's up to you. You can go and launch a student project at your university, or you can just think back. I mean, maybe you were, I don't know, the head of your church choir. That is leadership skills. You may not think about it that way, but you've probably done a lot more leadership skills in your life than what you're even aware of. And quite often it helps to ask other people around you about these things, because sometimes we're not aware of, you know, those kinds of experiences. So yeah, guys, use the time until the application deadline to boost your CV and to work on the areas where you can maybe improve. If you've never done any volunteer work in your life, it might be a good idea to do some now, because that is something a lot of scholarships look at. And yeah, like, don't be discouraged just because you don't meet every single soft criteria. I think that's quite important. And yeah, this is the last slide, and then I'll shut up. Just a quick reminder of how Africademics can support you, and we'll share all the links with you later. So like I said, we share daily scholarships it's mostly on Facebook, but we sometimes have things on Twitter as well, on Instagram, LinkedIn. There is a weekly scholarship news flash. I'll send you the link. You can sign up to that. So then every week on a Monday, you get a summary of all the latest scholarships that we are currently aware of. There is a searchable database on our website. It's not fully updated at the moment, so I'm just putting out a disclaimer. Yeah, just because it's been a lot of work to create it, and maintaining it is just as much work. So we are a little bit behind, but there are lots and lots of, there's hundreds of opportunities in there. And when you search our database, maybe don't search for scholarships with a specific date, but just look for recurring scholarships. And then even if the application date is not for this year, there's a good chance that we just haven't updated it yet. And you can still look at the program and go to the website and then find the current info. And yeah, and this is also a very nice one. So we have a WhatsApp channel. You can just join one of our WhatsApp groups, and every day you get one scholarship posted on the group, and other news as well. There is our podcast. There's our massive online course. You can find the details on our website, but I think we'll maybe also just put a little handout together for all of you, and then the GAIN team can send that to you. And then we do have our ambassador program, and we can see if we can maybe support not all of you, because we don't have enough ambassadors, but maybe some of you through our ambassador program later. Okay, thank you for your attention.